All right, welcome in everybody. We are so excited to see you tonight. I'm excited to share this. And I know Dr. Rapoli, this is something that he's very passionate about, which is the biosync diet. And some of you are familiar with it and some of you may not be. So let me just give you a little bit of ideas about us and then I'll just let him take it from there. So Dr. Rapoli is the medical director here at the Jacksonville Health and Wellness Center. So we are brick and mortar here in Jacksonville, Florida. But so he's been coaching and teaching and has treated and cared for over 8,000 patients. And well, I'm in the middle of letting people in. So Dr. Rapoli is amazing at bringing in that whole integrative, holistic approach to health. And he is a functional medicine doctor, a doctor of chiropractics. He's also the visionary behind our online coaching program, which is a certification program for practitioners, people who are wellness advocates, and just in love with health and wellness. So with all else ado, I just want to go ahead and let you start. And I also wanted to say, sorry, I almost forgot. I wanted to add that he's the author of The Illness to Wellness, which is a beautiful book that just talks about like integrating all of the practices that we teach up here at Jacksonville Health and Wellness. So super excited for this tonight and to share our hearts with you. So we'll do some questions and answers at the end if you have any questions at the end. So thank you so much, Dr. Rapoli.
Well, thank you guys for coming out here tonight. I appreciate it. I know it's late on a Tuesday evening, but I'm really excited to present this information. This has been a culmination over the last 25 years, putting together kind of a dietary approach that really can help with the mind, body, spirit, and to help, reverse and prevent degenerative diseases, everything from, heart disease and diabetes and metabolic dysfunction. And so I'm going to share my screen. We're going to jump straight into this. And then if anybody has questions at the end, we'll open it up. So let's see. And Amanda, I'm going to pull down my screen with everybody, so I just won't be able to see if anybody has questions. So just pop in and let me know if you do.
And there's a chat box on the side if anybody does have a question before we do the questions at the end.
Okay. Can you see the screen, Amanda?
I can see the along the top, but not on the side.
I mean, can you see the PowerPoint presentation?
I can see the PowerPoint, yes.
Okay. Yeah, that's all we need. Okay, so the title of this webinar is going to be The New Science of Eating and Gene Expression and Age Reversal. And so Amanda already introduced myself, so I'm going to skip this slide here. And there are, 4 principles or 4 tenets of the biosynchronization diet. But in general, the idea is that we want to sync our biology with the evolutionary drive. And so there are 4 tenets. We're going to go over each of them. One is evolutionary, one is the science component, one is the heart, and one has to do with something called dieta, which is the original meaning of diet. It's a Latin word, which means not just the macronutrients like carbs, fat, and protein, but really a way of living. So we'll start with the evolutionary approach first. So I think it's important first to define what evolution means, because there's a lot of misconceptions about the word. It technically means change over time. And when you look at like evolutionary biologists and you look at integral meta theory, there's this idea of transcend and include. Transcend and include. So in other words, if you think about the universe just starting out, we have these quirks, and then evolution moves forward and it does have direction. It's not basically this blind random event that's occurring, but there's a drive for more novelty. So it basically adds something new, maybe an atom, and that atom transcends, makes the atom, but it includes the quirks. And then we go from atoms to elements, and the elements do the same thing. They transcend and include. And then we move into molecules, which is now moving from physics to chemistry. And these molecules transcend the atoms and the quirks. And then we finally move into biology, which is the cells. The point is that evolution drives from transcend and include model. And from a practical standpoint, we have to think about this when we're looking at, from a dietary approach, because we want to gain the wisdom of our ancient ancestors because they had a lot to give us. But they did have dignities and they did have disasters, right? There were some positive things and some negative things. And we want to ride along the heels of 21st century living. So if we look at our ancient ancestors, their longevity was not great. Their quality of life did match their longevity. And if we look at 21st century living, it's kind of flipped, right? We're living longer, but our health span and our lifespan are just not the same, right? The whole point is we don't want to go back and just cherry pick one area in the past, like the Paleolithic era, and say, well, just because our ancestors, maybe ate meat, we should become a carnivore or we should be doing X, Y, Z. And there's some obvious reasons for that, right? Our ancestors didn't get everything right. There was slavery, there was issues with the treatment of women and animals, and 90% of the population was at war at any given point. And although the 21st century living has its own issues, right? Addictions to media and computers and the iPhones, less than 1% of the world is at war, right? So we have different problems that have arisen. The whole point here is that we have to steer clear away from black and white thinking when someone says we should go back into a time and we should follow this type of dietary approach. Haven't we learned, right? So anytime we don't really ride alongside the heels of evolution, we get a problem with transcend and include, because this idea threads itself in every dimension of existence, whether it's biology, psychology. So just to give you an easy example, transcend and include as you're growing up, right? And we look at the psychology. If we don't transcend our thinking, we get what's called addictions. And if we don't include the past or parts of the past, we can create shadows. And so anytime transcend or include from a biological standpoint, physics standpoint, goes array, we get some sort of pathology. So the idea is that when we look at syncing up our biology with the evolutionary thread, we have to take into account the best of ancient wisdom, and we have to look at where we're actually living today in the 21st century. The biosynchronization diet, we want to back it up, by science. We don't want to look at laboratory studies. We don't want to look at mouse studies. We don't want to look at double-blind, placebo-controlled studies. The best science to look at when we're talking about diet is real-world examples of the longest-lived populations across culture. So if we look at research from Dan Buettner and National Geographic in the blue zones, which looked at these pockets around the world of people living, their health span equals their lifespan. So they were a greater number of centenarians, right? So we can look at blue zone research. We can look at the original Mediterranean diet, which was really done on a specific island called Crete. And we could look at 7-day Adventist studies. We could look at something called the EPIC, or the European Perspective Investigation into Cancer Nutrition, the Harvard Nurses Study, all of these epidemiological studies. And what that means, it's the study of disease and how health spreads throughout a population. they all converge and basically have very similar tenets when it applies to diet. They all were eating relatively 90% plant-centric diet. And that's the only thing that has ever been proven on planet Earth to give us our health span and our lifespan. And so we have to be really careful when we look at science to not minimize these population studies, because when you look at like what is the ultimate litmus test? Well, it's that we're living longer, but we're also living while we're living, and we're going to sprinkle in some fulfillment and happiness. And that's what these populations are studying, right? So when we get research that is showing that they did this XYZ to a rat, or they've done this study on this one particular blueberry, or on the oxalates found in a certain type of vegetable, be very careful, right? Because you're going to miss the 10,000-foot view. The other part of this dietary approach is bringing the heart back into the equation. And I might say that this is maybe the most important, and it definitely is the one that is left out from almost every single dietary approach, but it's too important for us to throw out. It's too important for us to disregard. Science tells us that we should be eating this 80-90% plant-centric dietary approach from these epidemiological studies, but the heart kind of begs us and asks us to go 100%. And it's guided by the MOGO principle from the Institute for Humane Education. There's this idea, right? We want our life to be following this principle of the most good and least harm for all people, the animals, and the planet. But the amazing thing is that you're not only doing good, as if that wasn't good enough, you're also getting rewarded, right? This is one of the themes when I was writing my book, is this idea that doing good is actually good for you evolutionary. When you treat Mother Nature the right way, she gifts you with clean air and clean water. When you treat animals with compassion and love, you do not get the antibiotics and the pesticides and the herbicides that are thrown into their feed and that the animals consume. You also don't get the emotional and metaphysical toxins of pain and suffering, right? This is metaphysical karma, right? It's like we don't realize we should be holding a mirror up. When we try to fatten up animals with the feed, we in turn have a society that is obese. When we try to create flesh that is really tasty by making animals osteoporotic, like veal, we in turn become osteoporotic. So the whole point here is that we have to begin to shift our perspective from this egocentric, I-centered view to this more encompassing we-centered view when we choose food, right? Because I've had conversations with people, throughout the years, and there are some people who are, atomistic and mechanistic, where it's like, do you think we're just a body? And there are some people that might say, yes, we're just a body. But the vast majority of people, they say that we are a mind, body, and spirit, but we don't eat that way. We eat as if we're a physical body. We only eat to satisfy our taste, a pleasure, preference, convenience. But the idea here, if we're going to ride alongside the heels of evolution, moving from this I center of consciousness to we center of consciousness, we have to ride along the sides of compassion and love. And like I said, it's a boomerang effect. When we hug somebody, we get a hit of oxytocin. And so it's like the game of life is set up exactly the way it should be. And then finally, we have dieta. And dieta, like I said, we can think of macronutrients and micronutrients that they're deficient, it brings upon disease. But we don't think about, on our food pyramid, that we give our patients, at the very bottom of the food pyramid is universal human needs, right? So just like you're deficient in a vitamin or a mineral, you're going to get a disease. if you're deficient in, safety or security, love and belongingness, it's going to manifest as some sort of disease, whether it's physical, emotional, mental, relational, spiritual. So we want to look at all of these different dimensions, and that's really what Dieta is trying to bring to the picture, is that we're not just eating food. We're not nutrients should not be monopolized just by macro and micronutrients, but everything that we think, we say, we do as a nutrient. So we have to be really careful of what we're nourishing our bodies with on a regular basis. So I just wanted to, bring to light, because there are so many, and it kind of makes me crazy sometimes when we like look at some of these diets where people are so like narrow focused. And there's so many myths that are surrounding a lot of the diets that are out there, because you really can get confused when you walk into the bookstore, right? It's like, I mean, one person is saying eat plants, one says that plants are going to kill you because of the oxalates. Another person I saw, on YouTube, right, is saying, or Facebook, that smoothies will kill you. I mean, it's like all over the place. And so one of the things has to do surrounding this idea of, the Paleolithic, era. Like, let's go back and eat like our Paleolithic ancestors. The fossil records, you know, really the archaeological findings show that, fossilized plant remains, starch residues on our ancient tools, and the dental plaque analysis really showed that our ancestors ate a diet that was rich in fiber, fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes, and green leafy vegetables. When you look at our anatomy and physiology, we really weren't hunter gatherers. We were gatherers and maybe a little bit hunters. Because when you look at a carnivore, right, their digestive tract is really short, so the food goes in and out rather quickly. But humans have a very similar, digestive tract. It's 9 times the body length, right? Like an herbivore, and that's because we have to digest all of this, all of this fiber. And of course, no one, you just have to look at the mouth, right? Carnivores have sharp, elongated canines, and we have these small, blunt canines and flat molars that are really being used for optimizing grinding and plant-based materials. And the other thing is that a global meat-centric diet is logistically and ecologically impossible. And I'm not, that's not just a play on words. It truly is impossible, right? So 99% of all animal products, right, that are produced are factory farmed. So that means that less than 1% are coming from, if we could even say, some sort of idyllic situation. When you look at food labeling, and this kind of always, again, kind of amuses me in some ways, because that statistic, is 100% true, right? So we got 99% of animal products in the US are coming from factory farms. But then you go into the grocery store. I talk to people, all the time for the last 25 years. No, I'm eating sustained animal products. I'm getting cage free, this, and I'm getting animals that are graze free. Animals are property in the law throughout the world, right? You either have, they're either personhoods or they're property. And so they have no rights. And these labeling laws mean absolutely nothing, right? So like free range eggs, all they have to do is take the same old factory farm and just open up a window, right? And so there's so much manipulation. And I'll put in maybe the follow-up email a link to a webinar I did on reading food labels, so you can see all of the deception that goes through. But I pulled out a few statistics. I'll just read a couple of things really quick. Roughly 10 pounds of grain are needed to make a pound of beef versus just eating plants directly. Livestock today, pasture and the feed to grow, to feed the animals, already uses about 77-80% of all the agricultural land, yet it only delivers about 18% of global calories. So if everybody on Earth ate just 1/4 pound serving of an animal product a day, We would need roughly as much land as the size of the United States and China just to house the animals and grow their feed. In short, a truly global meat-centric diet simply can't be scaled without consuming far more land than our planet has to give. It's just not possible. So what went wrong? Basically, we went from the farm to the factory. So these are the 6 areas that we've identified that really has destroyed, our food system. We have decreased nutrient density, from the soil being eroded to just eating processed food. So there's no nutrients that are found in a lot of the foods that, the standard American diet kind of reverses what we were just talking about, that science tells us 80% of the food that we need to be eating should be whole food, plant centric, right? When you look at a standard American diet, the definition, right, of these industrial nations is that 80% of their food is processed and it's meat or animal centric. It's the absolute reversal. So we have a decreased nutrient density simply because people are just not eating enough fruits and vegetables. We have the rise of ultra processed foods, sugar, these industrial seed oils, the way they're processed, they kind of are manipulated in such unusual ways that they are cancer promoting. And then we have the rise of, white flour, where you take healthy grains, because grains are healthy, you take them and you strip them of the embryo, you strip them of the bran, and you're left with basically this sugar primarily. It's called the endosperm. And so it's devoid of all nutrients. And a lot of people joke and say, all of the processed foods are empty, they're empty calories. And that's kind of true, but they're actually not. They're actually not full of nutrients, but they're full of other crap, right? We call anti-nutrients and toxic burdens like pesticides and herbicides and all sorts of unusual products, GMOs and so forth. Scientists have figured a way to make the food more hyperpalatability to help with food addiction. So they figured out how to combine salt, sugar, and fat in just the right way to add to processed foods to make it addictive. We have factory farming, like we talked about, in CAFOs. That's an acronym that stands for concentrated animal feeding operations. And then we have disconnection, right? So I heard a lecturer one time say we basically we have our ecological umbilical cord is like cut, right? We go to the bathroom, we don't know where the waste is going. We put our garbage out on the street, we're not really sure where the garbage is going, right? So we don't really know the consequences, what happens when we go into the store and we buy a piece of meat or a piece of or dairy product. We can't be under the illusion anymore, because once you know and once you realize what's happening, we're participating in really the greatest way that we can vote is by what you pay for when you go to the store. So disconnection has caused us to prioritize convenience over compassion. So these kind of 6 identifiable factors that have ruined our food system has created inflammation. Polydysbiosis, just a fancy way of saying overgrowth of yeast bacteria in many different areas of the body, not just the GI, but the urinary tract and the skin and the respiratory tract, and so forth. We have environmental biotoxin accumulation, abnormal cell growth, and impaired regeneration. That's abnormal cell growth, of course, would be something that could lead to cancer. We have these acidic, oxygen-starved environments, and then all of these micro events start affecting all the macro events in the human body. It impairs our detox system, our hormone system, our cardiovascular system, and most importantly, our inability to regenerate. Because when we're stuck, the body is stuck trying to clean up all of the toxins that we're accumulating. There's no energy freed for what's called autophagy, which is to turn on these genes to clean up and then turn on stem cell production to not just repair and maintain cells, but we're looking to replace cells with new tissue. Biosync diet, of course, is designed to combat, chronic inflammation, restore gut microbial balance, optimize metabolism, mitochondrial health, reduce the toxic burden, enhance cellular regeneration, and reconnect us with our heart. So I'm going to go over our 6 steps, so that way you kind of get a feel for the dietary approach. And in, I think it's not next month, I believe in February, we're going to be doing a lecture on kind of the practical applications of meal planning. But I'm going to give you some hints tonight, just some quick take homes that you can kind of look and get a feel for it. So our first tenet is really to challenge everyone to flip the switch, right? Standard American diet is 80%, basically processed foods and animal centric, and we want to switch the switch there to a whole food plant-based diet, right? Not vegan, not vegetarian, whole food plant-based diet. Use those words. They're very important, right? Because Twinkies are, vegetarian and vegan, right? So we have to be really careful. We want to make sure this is a whole food-based diet. I like to break nutrients down into 3 areas. There's primary nutrients which come from plants. And of course, plants capture the energy from the sun. And, photosynthesis basically takes this magical energy from the sun and stores the energy in its plants in the leaves. And then animals come along and eat it. And we then get the nutrients. So, animals are what we refer to as secondary nutrients. And then tertiary nutrients are these weird things where you take primary nutrients and you take secondary nutrients and you make weird things out of them. So like with primary nutrients, you would take plant foods and make processed foods and donuts and bagels and things like that. And with secondary nutrients, you'd make weird things like deli meat, right? So we see a trend, right, that when you eat more secondary and tertiary nutrients, you increase degenerative diseases, everything from diabetes, cancer, osteoporosis, and so forth. And when you move into the direction of eating more primary nutrients, you have a reversal of the degenerative diseases. So the biosync, at a glance, you really can eat as much as you want of fruits and vegetables, intact grains. And an intact grain is, you look at the grain, 1 part grain like rice, 2 parts water, you boil it. And when you look at your plate, you actually see the grain. And then anytime you take that grain, you start doing things to it, you start making processed foods, right? Some processed foods are better than others. But ultimately, if you make flour, like white flour, it's devoid of the fiber and all of the vitamins and minerals. And then there's everything in between. Healthy fats, we want to use olives, olive oil, coconut, avocado, nuts, seeds, and their butters and their milks, beans, lentils, peas, mushrooms, and all sorts of tubers and potatoes. Foods to avoid is your meat, beef, chicken, turkey, dairy and eggs, gluten, fish, alcohol, processed foods, and so forth. Step 2, we won't talk too much about this. I'll just give you the Cliff Notes version, because I'll send you guys a webinar that is specifically on how to read food labels. But again, our purchase power, this is where we vote, right? So the one thing, and you can trust me just now, after you watch the webinar, you'll understand a little bit more, but ignore all marketing claims. And I mean that. Ignore all marketing claims on the labels. Go straight to the ingredient list. If you recognize every ingredient as a whole food, it's a thumbs up. And maybe it's not perfect, right? So you just want to make sure that a good portion, right, 90% more, are foods you obviously can recognize. You want to choose organic when possible, and that's going to help to ensure that you're avoiding pesticides, herbicides, and genetically modified organisms. And you want to prioritize regenerative, sustainable, locally grown foods, or what we call foods with integrity. Cooking and uncooking skills. We'll just go over a couple quick things, but you want to avoid the use of oils at high temperature. So I think most people can intuit, right, that if McDonald's were to use the best potatoes on planet Earth and let's say a $500 bottle of olive oil to make a French fry, we have some sort of intuition that a French fry is still not good for us, right? And that's because it's fried, right? So anytime you take a good oil, whether it's, you know, uh, extra virgin olive oil or coconut oil, whatever it might be, and you took it for long periods of time at high temperatures, you begin to change the molecular structure and it changes into like a trans fat. And trans fats are cancer promoting. Soaking and sprouting is a good technique, especially with people with digestive issues, right? It's, just a fancy way of saying, taking your grains or your beans and nuts and seeds and basically putting them in water and letting some of the natural anti-nutrients leach out into the water. It just makes it a little bit easier for digestion, and it sometimes enhances the nutrient quality. Maximizing nutrient density, we teach the plate method. So when you look down at your plate, you want to make sure a good portion, like, half to three quarters of your plate are loaded up with veggies. Massaging and scissoring is a technique that we teach, most of our patients. It's this idea that, oh my God, how am I supposed to, you're recommending how many servings of fruits and vegetables, 10 to 15? How am I supposed to do that? Well, one of the tricks is that most people are just used to like making these salads that are like ultra fluffy, right? So it's like, one or two servings. But if you take a bunch of greens, let's say five servings, and you use a scissor or you massage it, you basically can get almost like three, four, five servings of greens in like a handful. And it makes it easier to manage and to eat your salad. So those are really neat techniques. We use that all the time whenever we're eating greens so we can actually eat more of them. And then you want to have these nutrient dense staples, right? Salads, smoothies, and snacks. When I say snacks, basically you want to make sure, you're eating fresh fruits and vegetables like carrots and hummus and nuts and seeds, but you want to be snacking on real food. Fluid intake. The big thing here that we teach, right, is that you want to make sure that you're drinking the right type of water. So, the two recommendations here is to make sure that it's clean. So there's some sort of filtration like reverse osmosis, but you want to make sure that the water isn't dead. So you want to make sure that you're adding back in some of the natural minerals that are infused into the water to make it active, right? So that way, when it enters into the body, it's not dead, but it actually is alive to actually make things move in the body and to get the water into the right body compartment so you can actually stay hydrated. You want to stick with water mostly as your number one fluid intake. Acceptable is low glycemic vegetable and fruit juices and teas. Mindful and heartful eating. This is good to know, but it's also backed up by science, where if you're grateful, if you're being mindful, if you're being responsible, if you're taking your time to eat, I'm really bad at this. This is one that I have to work on a lot because I like to eat really quick. I really struggle with this one. I feel like I'm eating like it's like my last meal sometimes. And then I know people, we probably all know people, you could be there for like 3, 4 hours and they're still eating, right? So a lot of people go slow, some people go fast, but there is a difference in digestive enzyme production from the pancreas. Like if you're eating in the car going somewhere, if you were to measure your output from your pancreas of digestive enzymes, it's going to be smaller than if you were sitting at home, let's say with a loved one, and there's no TV on and you're just sitting there and talking. If you measured your digestive enzyme production, because you're in a parasympathetic state, your body is in what's called rest and digest, that it will actually produce more digestive enzymes. And so you actually get more absorption of the food that you're eating. Individualization, a couple things I'll go over here about intermittent fasting and timing of meals, but we always start out with kind of our general Stephen Covey, 7 habits of highly effective people idea of this: first things first, second things second, right? Don't worry about FODMAPs and nightshade vegetables and, food sensitivities and oxalates if you're eating processed foods and you're eating factory farmed animal products. Commit to 30, 90 days of whole food eating before focusing in on these second things second. And this is a struggle for 25 years with patients because people are so hyper focused and concentrating on, I just heard that spinach has oxalates and it can cause kidney stones, so I probably shouldn't be eating spinach, right? Hold on. Let me look at your food diary, right? And no, but you're eating Twinkies and Fruit Loops and all sorts of processed. Don't worry about that yet. First, clean up your diet, because if you go towards this 80, 90% whole foods approach, right, it will take care of most of the issues. And then second thing second becomes just nuances at this point. Because yes, sometimes you do have to worry about food sensitivities and food combining and nightshades and SIBO and FODMAPs and all sorts of different things. But you got to get the anchor first, which is first things first. So a little math here too. When we talk about these ratios or these percentages, I'm just going to give you something that's a little bit more tangible. We eat 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. So that's 21 meals, a week. So let's keep the math really simple. So let's say 20 meals a week, right? That you can make a good choice or bad choice. If you're eating 90%, whole food based, plant centric, that means you're only cheating with 2 meals during the week. And that's basically where science has pointed to. Some civilizations and some of these studies have shown, this 80% range, right, too, which would mean 4 cheat meals a week. So that just gives you a kind of a quick general idea of what 80 and 90% actually look like. Timing matters, right? This is another individual component here. We recommend trying to finish eating 2 to 4 hours before bed for better digestion and metabolism. And because in Ayurvedic medicine, the pitta energy is in the middle of the day. This is when your digestive fire is at its greatest. So it probably makes sense if you're able to, and not everybody, that's why this is individualized, but to make lunch, if you can, your biggest meal, wherein digestive energy is strongest. Intuitive fasting, we call it intuitive because there's no right or wrong way to do this, but we do know from an evolutionary and genetic standpoint, there are 2 genes that we care about. We want to make sure that are working properly for us. One is called mTOR. This is for growth. And then there's another one called AMPK, which basically shuts down the growth process and kind of gets us into this autophagy, cleanup. With intuitive fasting or fasting in general, we want to avoid the older mythos, right? Where we should, be eating all the time, small, frequent meals throughout the day. That's kind of a pretty much a mythos at this time. So we recommend if you're new to this, starting out with a 6 to 8 hour eating window, 2 to 3 times per week. This allows you the growth that comes from the food, but it also allows enough time in between eating to allow the body to do its magic, which is that cleanup, the autophagy, the regeneration. And it's intuitive in the sense that you can restrict the window even more, and you can increase the amount of days you're doing it, but this is a good starting point. Raw cook balance, we usually recommend starting with, if you don't know, should be eating cooked foods or raw foods, right? So one of the things I think that might be helpful is that we recommend, starting with the 75% raw food. This is not by calories. This is by volume, right? So what I mean by that is that you start out with 75% raw food. So what is that? So that's basically your fruits and your vegetables, and we'll consider some of these foods that are not cooked, like, nuts and seeds. But you want to, most of your, your daily intake should be coming from raw foods. And I do consider, steamed veggies raw, right? And then you adjust it based on the season. So during the wintertime, maybe you're eating, less raw foods. And during the summer and spring, you're doing more smoothies. So you do need to adjust it based on seasons, energy levels, and personal preferences. But this is just a general starting point. And what I mean by volume is that if you were to look at a plate as an example, and let's say that, 3/4 of the plate are loaded with vegetables, like a big salad, by volume, that's 75% raw, right? But if you had a small portion, a quarter of it with, potatoes and some rice or quinoa or something like that, potentially you might be eating more calories from those types of foods. That's why we kind of look at this raw cook balance by volume, not calories. When you're in a healing crisis, it does make sense, right? To think about supporting your recovery with fresh green juices, sprout packed salads and detoxes and healing meals. And then, I leave you with this kind of idea that you have to pick, right? I'm promoting that science and the heart tells us to try to shoot for 100%, right? No one is perfect, but you have to commit. What are you willing to do? Is it that 80, 90, 100% commitment? And hopefully I've convinced you at least that the ratio that we're currently doing, the standard American ratio of 80% processed foods and meat centric, is not helping us evolutionary. So one thing I'm going to leave you with here is I'm just going to, this is common sense, but common sense is not sometimes practice. I'm just going to give you like a little homework assignment to do for next week. And that is really to create a sample week for yourself. So you're going to populate, Monday, Tuesday, all the way through Sunday, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You're going to populate your meals. So I'm going to give you what you're going to use to populate, this your meals for the week. So the goal is not to spend a lot of time in the kitchen. It's not that you have to spend hours and hours a week, cooking, unless you want to. Some people like doing that. But there's meal prep cooking, which is traditional meal preparation that involves 30 plus minutes, chopping, grilling, sauteing, etc. And then there's something called meal prep assembling, right? They require no preparation. This is the category I really like, right? It's like taking stuff and putting it in a blender and pressing a button, or taking a nice salad and putting organic can of beans and opening or cutting up an avocado and spreading it in there, grabbing nuts and seeds, carrots and hummus, right? Those what I refer to as meal prep assembling. And when you're populating, your meal plan for the week, here's some things to think about. You're going to populate it with these terms. So you all have a past healthy meal, something that's familiar, that's healthy. I mean, everybody has at least eaten some sort of healthy meal at some point in their life. So bring that with you on this new journey, right? Bring that past healthy meal with you. Bring a healthified meal with you. So this is a past meal that you're familiar making, but you're going to do what we refer to as healthify. So as an example, whatever meal that you traditionally eat, how can you make it more healthified? Well, follow that, plate method where 3/4 of that plate, add more vegetables to it, add a salad, massage your greens so you're getting 3, 4 more servings of vegetables, right? So healthify a current meal that you already know how to make. Obviously, you can experiment with a new healthy meal. You can use leftovers. You can skip a meal. You can eat out. You can cheat. You can make a salad and smoothie. These are our staples for really packing in nutrient density. And then you populate, right? So in this example, this person cooked only 4 times throughout the entire week. As an example, Monday was a smoothie. They had one type of salad, we call it salad one. They used a past healthy meal that they were already comfortable with. Tuesday was a smoothie, again, for breakfast. Lunch, they had some leftovers from the night before, and so forth. But the thing is, if you don't really sit to kind of figure this out, if you're not disciplined, which some people are not, then you're going to succumb to temptation, right? So it's always a lot easier to prevent than to treat something, right? So, if you're starving, it's easier for you to go with what you're comfortable with and used to. If that's going to drive through to go to McDonald's, right? You already know what that is. So you have to figure a way to prep the week so that way you're breaking, these habits. All right, so I'm gonna pause here and just open this up if anybody has either questions or just wants to share or has comments. So let me come back here.